This is Laura London, and you're listening to Speaking of Jung. Joining us today for episode 101 is the great-grandson of C.G. Jung, Dr. Thomas Fischer, in Vienna, Austria. Born in 1971, he grew up in Küsnacht, Switzerland, and studied history, political science, and international and public law at the University of Brussels and the University of Zürich, where he earned a Ph.D. He then went on to conduct post-doctoral research with a specialization in the history of the neutral states in the Cold War and lecture at the Universities of Beirut, Vienna, and Helsinki, and at the Graduate Institute of International Affairs and Development Studies in Geneva. In 2008, he began working for the newly established Foundation of the Works of C.G. Jung, created by the community of Heirs to maintain and develop the literary and artistic estate of Carl Gustav Jung and his wife, Emma Jung-Rauschenbach. He served as director of the foundation from 2013 to 2020 and is co-editor of their first publication, The Art of C.G. Jung, released in 2018. Currently, he is involved with a number of new editorial projects of the foundation, including the publication of the original protocols for Memories, Dreams, Reflections. This spring, Dr. Fischer will be presenting Jung after the publication of the Red Book, a view from the foundation of the works of C.G. Jung, at the Eranos conference, Jung's Red Book for Our Time, Searching for Soul Under Postmodern Conditions, to be held April 28th through May 1st in Ascona, Switzerland. Other presenters include Speaking of Jung guests Maurice Stein, Nancy Swift-Berlotti, and Frank McMillan. Please visit the website speakingofjung.com for more information on everything discussed in this episode. This interview is being recorded on Wednesday, January 12th, 2022, through the magic of Skype. Dr. Fischer, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
I would like to start with telling our listeners how exactly you are related to Jung and how, along with your fellow heirs, have created this foundation, the foundation of the works of C.G. Jung.
Yeah, thank you. So my relation to Carl and Emma Jung-Rauschenbach goes through my mother's line. My grandmother, Helene Hoerni-Jung, known as Lil, was the youngest of the 5 children of Carl and Emma Jung. And I actually, as a student, lived in the house of my grandmother, and that was when I first got a taste of the business, the family business around publishing Jung and keeping the legacy alive.
She was your grandmother. She lived to be 100, right? She passed away just in 2014.
Yeah, she was an impressive woman, and it was a great blessing that she kept a very clear mind until her very last days. And she was an important point of reference, a source of information, even in my time when I started working for the foundation still.
She actually wrote, I found, the afterword for a book titled Love and Sacrifice, The Life of Emma Jung. So she's also written books herself, right? I've only been able to find them in German, though.
That's correct. And so initially she was a tailor. She quit school. But then late in her life or midlife, her husband died early, and obviously, her own children, including my mother, went out of the house. And I think that is when she turned to new subjects and discovered the psychological interpretation of icons, religious icons, as her topic, and that is what she wrote about. I think 2 or 3 books, at fairly old age already. I think her first book she published in her 70s, if I remember correctly. Oh. And that was quite a big thing.
Mm-hmm. And they are still available on Amazon. I'll provide links to those in the show notes. And I'd like to ask you about the current heirs who are active. There is a photo in Sarah Corbett's story that ran in the New York Times Magazine that was concurrent with the release of the Red Book in 2009. It's titled Holy Grail of the Unconscious. And the photo is of 3 of Jung's heirs, Peter Jung, Andreas Jung, and Ulrich Hoerni. And I'd like for you to tell us who they are.
Yes, I certainly remember this picture, and I'm very familiar with the 3 men you mentioned. So, and they were each in their capacity very important in setting up our foundation and bringing the Red Book to publication. So rightfully, they are the ones who were portrayed in this picture and coverage. So you have Andreas and Peter Jung, who are brothers. Andreas Jung, and I'm sure a couple of our listeners will know, until today lives in the house that C.G. and Emma Jung built in Küsnacht. So many have come across his name when they visited the house. He also has, through his father, inherited the family archive with the more private material of C.G. and Carl Jung. And that is one point of contact I had during my time as the director of the foundation. Whenever we were looking into that material, we would work together with him. Mm-hmm. And obviously, as such, he was important to access material related and unlocking the contents of the Red Book. His brother, Peter Jung, himself a psychiatrist, he, together with Ulrich Hoerni, who is a direct uncle of mine, thus a son of my grandmother, Lil Hoerni, he and Peter were very key in establishing the foundation of the works of C.G. Jung. They belonged to the committee already established by the Society of Heirs to deal with the publication affairs. And in the 1990s, early 2000s, it was a long process of transferring the copyrights that the descendants inherited into and established the foundation. The idea then was the family had grown to a substantial number. Mm-hmm. Carl and Emma had 5 children. They all had children. And as such, doing the business and doing the work of looking after the literary estate of their predecessors became more complicated. At the same time, after publication of the collected works and the dwindling of the currency exchange rate from the dollar to the Swiss franc, they were looking for ways of keeping the money that came from the royalties and reinvesting that in new projects. Mm-hmm. So that in somewhat is somewhat a short version of how the foundation, what the basic idea of establishing the foundation was, to make it formally independent of the community of heirs, because not everyone was still interested to be in being involved in that, but keeping the knowledge, and that was possible by those in the family who kept engaged and also were willing to work for the foundation, supply members for the first board, and supply their knowledge to the editorial work and the research that is undertaken until today by the foundation. So, and Ulrich and Peter were very key in bringing about the process that led to the establishment of the foundation, which surely, I remember this, I was a teenager, I think, at the time, and or a young adult, and I remember long discussions and how to best set this up and what everyone in the family would think of it and which was the right way to go. And it was only thanks to the persistence and also to the work and the thought that went into the establishment of the foundation that it became possible to set up the framework that allowed us to continue working in the way in which the foundation works today.
Mm-hmm. So the former community of the Heirs of C.G. Jung disbanded in 2008, and it's sort of morphed into the foundation of the Works of C.G. Jung, which is the exclusive owner of all of the copyrights of the literary and visual artistic works of both Carl and Emma Jung. So you mentioned the house, and I would like to jump to that because the Jung family home there on Seestrasse in Küsnacht, it was not open to the public when I visited in 2015. So I just saw the front of the house and took a lot of photos and just was in awe of how beautiful it is. But it is now open to the public as a museum. Would you tell us about that?
Yes, very much so. You are right. And this brings us to an important distinction. When Carl Jung passed away, the house was passed on to his only son, Franz Jung. So basically, as all the material goods were distributed according to his will among his descendants, the copyrights, they are an immaterial good, and they cannot be split in the proper sense among all the heirs. So for this reason, the community of heirs continued to exist. But that around everything involving the copyrights. But with the house, the situation is different. Mm-hmm. And so the house went to the only son, Franz Jung, and in the next generation, it went, as I mentioned previously, to Andreas Jung, the youngest of Franz Jung's children. Andreas and his family have lived there for a long time, first together with Franz Jung still, and when he passed away in the 90s with his family alone. But he set up plans to preserve the house as a lieu de mémoire, a central place to remember and to experience the work of Jung. And he was finally able to build up a different foundation, which nowadays looks after the house, looks after the maintenance of the premises, and has established a small museum. The situation currently is that half of the house is still inhabited by Andreas Jung and his wife Vreni. These are the upper floors, whereas they vacated the ground floor and the library and study, and actually returned it. Part of it was returned into its previous form as it was at the moment of Jung's death. So, as a visitor, you basically are able to see the family room, so to speak, the dining, and most importantly, the study where he produced a lot of his works, where he saw patients. You are able to see that as a small museum today, but the idea is not a classic museum. It's really that you can have the experience, and they've done a wonderful job. And it's really thanks to Andreas Jung and those who joined him in that undertaking and are doing the work nowadays around the museum that much of this spirit is still kept alive when you're in the building. I go there myself every now and again for research, be it in a library or in the family archive, and they've really done also because Franz Jung and Andreas Jung, although they lived there with their families, they kept a lot of the initial furniture, installations. They renovated very carefully. Andreas Jung himself is an architect and has a keen sense for keeping the literally built legacy of Jung's life. And in the past few years, since they opened up the museum, also a number of objects, also documents, but objects, even clothes, pieces of furniture have actually returned to the museum. They were mostly, or some of them were scattered among the family, the wider relatives. And as they opened up the museum, many offered to return these things because they felt it was one thing to keep them as personal memorabilia, but it was another thing to share them with the wider public and those interested in the life and work of Carl and Emma Jung.
And from what I understand, there are special exhibitions periodically in the home. The current one is titled C.G. Jung, Early Visual and Creative Works. It's been extended until the autumn of 2022. And the House of C.G. Jung has a beautiful website. There will be a link to it in the show notes. And on that website, there is also a virtual tour that you can take with some really lovely photos of the inside of the house, which I had never seen before, and the photos are just wonderful. So I want to give my thanks to your family for providing that. I'd like to also talk about Jung's private library and his papers. So you were mentioning the copyrights and what people inherited, but according to his last will, he gave his scientific literary estate to the ETH in Zurich. So his paper collection is part of the ETH Zurich University archives, and they are accessible. Would you tell us about that?
Yes, very much so. That is correct. And that's an important piece of information for anyone interested in going into deeper research beyond the published literature. Mm-hmm. There's a whole discipline nowadays which was developed in the 1990s in the history of psychology. And obviously Carl Jung and his work is an important part of this history. And his what is called the scientific papers at ETH are an important source of information for anyone interested in that domain. That contains almost all his manuscript material. That is what was at least in the house at the time of his passing away. Mm. That also contains his professional correspondence. That's over 30,000 letters which are preserved there. And only the more private, the private correspondence, that is the family correspondence, and his private notebooks, agendas, things, the red book, the black books, they were kept as he stated himself, or stated his will, with the family. But the rest went to the ETH, and that since the opening of that paper collection in the late 1980s, early 1990s, it is accessible. And people have become more aware. It's actually one of the most visited collections in that archive. I've regularly been told by the responsibles there. So it draws a lot of attention. Summertime is usually busy with people coming from all over the world, in fact, to dig deeper.
And Jung's private library, that's separate, right? And that's still in the home. And in fact, the photo I have of you for this episode, which is on the episode page on the website, speakingofjung.com, is you inside Jung's private library. And I was trying to read all the book spines in the photo, and it's like mostly all Goethe. It's a lovely photo. So would you tell us about his private library?
Yes. So also, according to his will, he decided that his study books, all the literature he collected throughout his life, his academic life, his studying life, his publishing life, shall be kept also as a source of further research. These books shall be kept in their present location as long as possible, which is the house of C.G. Jung with the museum today. And that gives us the beauty of actually having the books in their place where he actually worked with them. Mm-hmm. The interesting constellation, as an aside here, is that the books were considered as part of the heritage of the whole community of Heirs. The bookshelves, the building, belong to the house. So it is today still the foundation of the works of C.G. Jung that is the owner of that library, the books. The bookshelves belong to the foundation that runs the museum and owns the premises today. But that tells you something about how close the collaboration is and has to be to make things work. The library is a beautiful and fascinating testimony to the way of how Carl Jung was working, to his trajectory through different disciplines and study materials. I mean, the usual request we receive is from someone editing material or doing a Ph.D. And he finds traces of Carl Jung, cites a certain author or work, and then the question comes to us, so is that book still, did he own that book? Are there any notes in the margin? If he had a copy, are there any notes in the margin? Are there perhaps separate notes from his reading? And then that is the point where we go into the library. Sometimes it is possible to have a researcher at the library. That was the idea of Carl Jung himself, that scholars that were interested in specific aspects should be able to consult these works. So we help them to access them, those books, and see what we find there. And for me, as a trained historian, I find this one of the beauties of my work for the foundation, when we are able to collect the different pieces and see how ideas, how he developed ideas, how he enriched his own ideas with the lecture of other authors, and how his thoughts and theories, methods developed over time. The library and other archival material, they become even more important today, as almost nobody is still around that has actually been part of his scholarly and psychological journey, so to speak. And then, therefore, we need to rely on what is left in writing. And the library is part of that legacy. I would like to use this opportunity to point out the beautiful book that Sonu Shamdasani published, C.G. Jung, A Biography in Books, around the library, and Jung's reading of some of the key works from his library and how they fit in with the development of his own texts and manuscripts. That's a wonderfully illustrated, also with beautiful images, volume that gives you a good entry point to the library of C.G. Jung.
Yes, thank you for mentioning that book. I will have a link to it in the show notes. Again, it's titled C.G. Jung, A Biography in Books, by guest on this podcast, Professor Sonu Shamdasani. And you yourself, Dr. Fischer, wrote an article that appeared in the International Journal of Jungian Studies back in 2011 titled The Alchemical Rare Book Collection of C.G. Jung. Would you tell us what's in that paper?
Yeah. This was actually one of my early tasks. I started working for the foundation, I think in 2008. And at the time, we were approached by a professor of chemistry from the ETH Zürich who had an interest in the old alchemical literature. It was known that at the time already that Carl Jung had a precious collection of around 200 works of alchemical rare books in his library. And the suggestion was to digitize these books, to preserve them if any damage ever occurred, and for the other also to make them accessible in a wider framework of a large-scale digitization project that was carried out at the time by the ETH and actually most university libraries in Zurich, which were digitizing their rare books. And this special collection in the Jung Library was considered so special that they came up with the suggestion if we didn't want to join that larger project with the digitization of that book. And that was I think that was one of the first projects I did in full responsibility. So I was bringing these books to the Digi Center at the ETH, where they were scanned, doing the back and forth. We could only take around 10 books at the time for insurance reasons, because some of them are valuable. But in the end result, this allowed the publication on this digital platform, which is called e-rara.ch. And in the article you mentioned, I was speaking about that. I mean, this is how I came in touch with through this project work. Obviously, I had first to understand which were the books that had to be included, what category of rare books he actually collected. So we found a file with orders at book antiquarians from his days, where he was actually looking and specifically seeking such volumes. So that allowed me to trace his hunt for the alchemical treasures he collected in form of these old volumes, which I thought was a fascinating task, and obviously it opened up for me the door also to his understanding or his interest in the psychological reading of the alchemical literature, which is widely known today, and various authors have pointed out that Jung's way of studying and looking in a psychological way at the processes that are described in this literature actually triggered a tremendous new revival in alchemy in the 20th century. Of course, from a specific angle, but one that allowed and raised the interest of many that before didn't have anything to do with alchemy, that was seen often as just a stage of pre-modern chemistry. Mm-hmm. So that is I think that was the main point of the article, to illustrate how Jung became a collector of such alchemical rare prints. It wasn't the article is not necessarily giving you an interpretation or an explanation of his psychology and his understanding, but really at what time did he start, what motivated him to start looking for these books, what specific, there's different categories in the alchemical literature, and it's no surprise that the collection shows he was specifically interested in transformation processes. Mm-hmm. Because they have an obvious parallel to the process of individuation. And this is where he could link his own thoughts to these very long-standing philosophical traditions, if you want to say so.
So I would like now to talk about 3 books: The Red Book, The Art of C.G. Jung, and Memories, Dreams, Reflections. I have to ask you this question. It was a big question back in 2009, early 2010. After the release of the Red Book, I attended a presentation at the Jung Center here in Chicago, given by an analyst who was at the Rubin Museum for the exhibition of the Red Book. He was asked a question by somebody in the audience as to whether or not Jung intended for the Red Book to be published. And I would like to ask you that question and then have you tell us a little bit about how that came to be.
That's a good question, and one that the Heirs pondered for a long time and weren't sure about in the beginning. What was his wish? What was his idea? One problem the Heirs faced at the time was they couldn't go back and ask him, and he didn't state anything explicitly, but they were left the Red Book, so he didn't destroy it. In the meantime, but that is only years after the publication, we found material that clearly documents that Jung himself considered publishing the Red Book. But for reasons we can only speculate, decided not to at the time. The speculation, and it's an obvious one, is that he was afraid that if he would publish this work, his reputation as a scholar would be gone. Psychology was a very new discipline, which had already was was criticized for being non-scientific. Whenever a new discipline emerges, the field is usually already occupied by other disciplines. In this case, there were the medical doctors, the psychiatrists, philosophy, and there's a fear that a new discipline is going to take away something from you. I think this is what psychology experienced at its early stages. So it had to carve out its niche and then grow from there. And I think he was simply afraid that if at that time, and for what I want to say is for that reason, he and others were so keen, at least in the early period, to prove that theirs was a science on rational ground, that we are almost sure that, and this is also what the material I refer to seems to show, is that he was afraid that he would simply no longer be seen as a scientist, and therefore damage a reputation which wasn't fully established at the time. And also, in a sense, and I guess that was the big question for the family at the time. I wasn't involved, I was too young. I mean, I was aware of the discussions, but I wasn't part of the discussions. The main fear was this is too personal. One problem with that question was, what does it all mean? What is the Red Book? Yeah. And to be honest, without a detailed study and contextualization that was only undertaken in the course of the editorial work by Professor Shamsani on the basis of the groundwork that was laid by my uncle Ulrich Hoerni, Peter Jung, Andreas Jung that we mentioned earlier, who were able to bring by some information from the family, also anecdotal evidence. It was only then possible to slowly understand what this was. I mean, Jung spoke him. I mean, he broke the silence in his memories, where he speaks about his Red Book experience, the confrontation with the unconscious. But I think for the family, it was very unclear what it really was, and how. I think there was a great fear of how it would be received. Would it be seen as just a product of mental illness, or was it? And that is what I think became clear in the course of the editorial work, and also in the course of, or in the wake of publication, that this was a very much. I mean, he was in dire straits at these times, and he was troubled, but he found a way of working through these troubles in the form of the Red Book. But I think that partly explains some of the initial hesitancy of whether to make this material available to a wider audience. And it certainly explains why it took so long from the moment of a decision to publish and then actually being ready for publication, because you really had to sit down with this material to understand that there were a few witnesses. So he had shown the book during his lifetime to some of his companions. Obviously, also Emma was aware of it. So he discussed it, and we do think he's shown it to others also to find out their reactions. Mm-hmm. So for sure he was pondering, but at the time he wasn't ready for it, and apparently that decision remained until the very end. But we, it is. I mean, he was aware that at least when he at the end of his life, he was aware that he had become a public figure, that his work had found a strong foothold around the globe. And to him, it was no question early on that the Red Book was a vital source of anything he published after the 1920s. And he said so on various occasions. So he was aware that this was a key source to further understand his work, his ideas, his psychology, but hesitant to let it go out in the open during his lifetime. I guess we're speculating, but you could say he probably speculated that at one point someone among his older descendants would have to make a decision if the time was right, and that moment was found around at the time of the publication.
Yes, and it certainly was the right time, I believe, because of how well it was received.
We can only, that's a good, we can only, with hindsight, we know that some of the fears were unjustified, and the reception has been beyond anyone's expectation, and it's stunning us still today that the Red Book, it keeps selling copies, and that tells us, and by now it has reached an audience far beyond the identified Jungian readership.
Oh yeah,
and it doesn't stop. And one of the persons who clearly saw the appeal, but also the uniqueness of this work was late editor-in-chief Jim Ayres at Norton. He was the one person in the publishing world, after many initial rejections by other publishing houses, who said this needs to be presented, and it needs to be presented in this very rich format that had been chosen in the end, and that people will be fascinated by the richness of this material. And this is exactly what happened. But at the time, expectations were low or uncertain how it would be received. If it was something that would remain in the court in a somewhat in a certain corner, so to speak, with a limited audience, but it has reached an attention that no one ever could see coming. But it is telling because it shows how his work and his life fascinates people. His experience, his searching, obviously, is a tale that many can relate to.
Yes, and I just want to say, for me personally, I never thought in reading the Red Book that it was a sign of mental illness. That is something that Jung brought to my life, is that it's not mental illness, it's just the human condition. And that brings me to what's usually referred to as his autobiography, but it's not exactly. And that is Memories, Dreams, Reflections, which on the cover of the book, it says, recorded and edited by Anila Yaffe. And it was published posthumously right after Jung's death. And I just noticed in the introduction, which I hadn't remembered, that Jung said, I have had to promise myself that the results would not be published in my lifetime. So would you tell us about Memories and about the project that you're working on right now with Professor Shamdasani and Dr. Robert Hinshaw on the protocols for Memories, Dreams, Reflections?
Yes, for those who are aware of memory streams and the genesis of memory streams and reflections, the title page states clearly how this project came about, namely that Jung was approached by more than one publisher with the request to write his autobiography. He declined partly due to old age, also because he was still writing his own, working on his own texts, and didn't necessarily want to spend his final energy or his remaining energy on writing an autobiography. At the same time, during the 1950s, he was finally convinced by then publisher Kurt Wolff that if he wasn't involved in some way, then someone else will write the biographies, and he decided that he at least wanted to be available. And the format they decided on was following Goethe's biography in the form of interviews with talks with Eckermann, and that is what he was willing to do. So he would sit down with his then private secretary Agnella Jaffe and talk rather freely about his life, encounters, his works, psychology, his inner experiences. And she would then, she would sit with him and take stenographic notes, put them into longhand as she went home. And from those notes started to form this in a coherent book, or in a more structured book. But in the course of these interviews, conversations, obviously there was more material that went into the final book, and that was long known. And in particular for researchers looking for specific clues about personalities he met, about ideas, about certain dreams, experiences he had, it is known for quite a while that the original protocols contain additional material. Mm-hmm. Also, there was the assumption that the publisher and even some of the heirs were intervening before final publication. The American publisher thought certain topics, certain personalities were not known to the US readers, so they better be left out. The family thought some of the family details didn't belong to this biography or to the memories. So there is a curiosity in what he actually gave as information to Agnella Jaffe, and thanks to her meticulous work, we actually have a fairly close recording of his initial statements, and this is what we're now preparing in collaboration with Robert Hinshaw for publication. So that will. Many of the stories will be familiar from memories, but there's a bulk of additional material that is unknown yet, and the richness in detail, and also it's more raw. You get much closer in the protocols to him actually speaking, though we all are aware it is already a first recording. But still, it feels like, you could say it feels like sitting with him in the study, in Agnella Jaffe's seat, and hear him talk. And that has for sure a certain appeal. He was a very good, he was rhetorically very good. He was a good speaker. He had a good sense of humor. And of course, you can see his brilliant mind working through a range of topics, fairly freely associating. Sometimes these conversations recorded things that were on his mind from last night's dreams, and then he connects it to events that he experienced 50 years earlier. So he himself is not always super accurate with dates and names, which is understandable when you're in your 80s. Looking back, but the interesting and fascinating thing is certainly the connections he draws. And sometimes he spoke about a specific, significant experience or event on several occasions to Agnella Jaffe, and it is fascinating to see which elements he remembered or emphasized in these memories.
There is one misconception, actually two, that I would like for you to clear up here. And one is, I have to ask you, I asked you this when we spoke a few months ago, if you were willing to address this, and that is something that Marie-Louise von Franz said to Suzanne Wagner in her interview in the Remembering Jung series, which made it into Matter of Heart. It's about Jung's final vision, a vision he had at the end of his life that he relayed to one of his daughters, and von Franz said she put those notes in a drawer and she doesn't want to talk about them. Would you clear that up for us?
Yes, I got this question a number of times during my directorship at the foundation. What transpires is there. So far, we were not able to put our hand on something like a manuscript or a full notes of said vision. So what we have is von Franz's testimony, though she wasn't the one present when he spoke about this vision. The one present was his daughter Marianne Nierhuis, who, if I remember correctly, told it to Barbara Hanna, and she then informed Marie-Louise von Franz. So I understand the fascination. And von Franz is convinced that it was a big vision about the end of humanity, basically.
Yeah.
The problem really is with the source. It went through a number of hands until von Franz really got hold of the content of this vision. So there's an uncertainty. There's a few traces of it, but it's for us. It's not enough to assertively confirm what the exact vision was. Also, you shouldn't forget that was at the stage where he was ill. He was in fevers. It sounds a bit like he was in and out. It's not even sure how clear his daughter understood what he was telling.
Okay.
And that, I mean, but it is a good example for what we aim for with the work at our foundation. These questions are important, and obviously people are interested, and rightfully so. But when the question comes up, we're not just trying to make a sensation of it, but what we're looking into is, what are the real traces that we found? Do we have enough either spoken evidence, credible sources, written sources that would confirm or reject, or that can support anything? So to me, it is still unclear when I listen to von Franz's recorded interview. It is still unclear if she had any additional information. It certainly wasn't herself that Jung told that vision to, and there's a likely margin of error. Maybe margin of error is the wrong expression, but as a story is told through a number of people, there's a risk that it gets enriched.
Right.
So for us, it's difficult to assess the statement that von Franz gave in that interview. And when we work with editors and researchers, that is the one thing we request, is that they come up with a convincing argumentation and documentation of what they state and present then to a wider audience. We see part of our job in a certain quality control or control of a certain standard. There was a time, earlier when speculation filled more pages in books than the actual documented substance. That has changed over the past 2 decades for sure, and there's really a new, in the wake of Shamdasani's works and others, there's a new generation of young, but also established researchers. I want to do justice to everyone who are trying to really pin down things to what they can actually find in the documents and in the archives, and they go a long way to find these sources. I'm impressed with what we are then confronted with when they tell us, look, in some place, somewhere in someone's notebook, there's this and that often leads us to new traces, and we are able to connect some of the loose ends in his life story, which is tremendous, of course, when you're then finally able to bring about a full picture, or at least a substantial picture, which is more than anecdotal.
Yes, and I do appreciate that about you. The other misconception I would love for you to clear up is something that I'm guilty of saying on this podcast several times, which is that a majority of Jung's work is still unpublished, and that is not true.
It is. It may need a bit of explanation. It is true that among the thousands of pages of manuscript material at ETH, there's still substantial unpublished material. However, those who've edited the collected works, they did their job, and that means and Jung himself was still involved in the conception of that project, and so the collected works, they contain the main material and manuscripts. So what remains to be studied and considered for further publication are different categories: text variants, some clinical material from the early period. I mentioned correspondences. An important segment is notes made by third parties of Jung's talks, lectures, seminars, interviews. Mostly he didn't work with fully elaborated manuscripts when he spoke at university, at conferences, but he had sheets with keywords. But then you had, at the time, as you had people taking stenographic notes, you are able to reconstruct some of these seminars and lectures thanks to these note takers. And one of the biggest projects currently on the way, and you are aware, is the publication of his ETH lectures, which ran from 1933 to 1942. And the Philemon series is currently editing these. So that means compiling, reconstructing his lecture from a set of notes from different note takers to an integral text and make that accessible as if it was a lecture manuscript. That's a huge project. 3 volumes are out by now. The 4th is coming next soon this year, and there's 4 more volumes coming. The beauty again of his lectures and seminars is that you hear Jung speak, and if you read Jung, you are aware that his own manuscripts are not always easy to read. It's a bit of work. Yeah. The beauty of when he spoke was that it is more accessible. Mm-hmm. And in his ETH lecture series, he went basically through the whole development of the early modern psychology and development of his own psychology up until that very moment. In a language that, at least for someone like myself, is more accessible, it is more vivid. There's the eventual anecdote which illustrates what he means, where he would rely on a more scientific way of speaking and writing in his book publication. So that is something that remains to be brought to publications. Then remaining material of fragments, drafts, concepts, but for sure autobiographical material, and I count the protocols, for example, in that category. Mm-hmm. The other category that remained largely unpublished was the visual artistic material, and the Red Book has only opened. I mean, the Red Book was the cornerstone, the stepping stone to the publication of the Red Book into this world, which led us then to publish the Art of C.G. Jung volume, which you've mentioned earlier. So this, together with Emma Jung's literary and artistic estate, which is our new project, from the foundation side. So these are some of the materials. So the idea that there are large amounts is right, that remain unpublished is right and wrong. Okay. Right in the sense that these are many pages, but a lot of this, the unpublished material, are variants, versions, drafts of already published texts. Also, as you are aware, he would rework his texts a lot and republish in a new form. He would talk about the same topics in a series of publications and seminars. So there's overlap with what is already, partly there's overlap with what is already in the collected works. But yes, there remains more material, and the Philemon Foundation, which partners with us as a donor and by providing the expertise in editing some of these materials, they have a very good pipeline of new publications coming down the line. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so our final topic for today is the book, The Art of C.G. Jung, which was published by the foundation, edited by the foundation. And as you mentioned, your uncle, Ulrich Hoerni, he began in the early 1990s to compile this information. And people know Jung for his writings, his lectures, interviews, but as you point out, few knew of the vital role that his visual art played.
Again, Carl Jung was responsible for the lack of awareness of this,
right.
this part of his work himself, in the sense that during his lifetime he only published very few of his paintings, and that only anonymously. Mm-hmm. So he didn't disclose that he was actually the author of said paintings. He included some in the discussion of material in the collected works, but it doesn't disclose that these works were actually made by his own hand. Mm-hmm. And with the Red Book, but he spoke about the fact again in Memories, Dreams, and Reflections that he was not only writing, but was spending a substantial time also drawing, painting, sculpturing in wood, carving in stone. Those who visited him at his tower retreat in Bollingen could see the results of such work. Or even in Küsnacht, in the house, there were traces of this side. Carl Jung was very much a visual thinker, we discovered in the course of producing the Art of C.G. Jung volume. I mean, he himself has written about it, that there are two ways of thinking in words, which was directed by logic and rationale, and the other was non-directed thinking in images. And this is, and what we have as, if we want to call it that, artwork from his hand is exactly the result of thinking in images. He was self-taught, and he mastered quite beautifully, as again the Red Book witnesses, a number of techniques as his sculpture witness. And he was deeply engaged in the discussion about art and the symbolic meaning of art. So he was very keen on the visual. And as he sought a way to put his own dreams and fantasies into a language, he found that the image actually, he was able to express these representations much better in an imagery world than in actual words. I'm not telling any of our listeners anything new, I guess, but it is still worth pointing out the level, the high level of artistic quality he achieved. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, it is worth recalling that he himself never viewed the results of his visual creative work as actual art. To him, it was always an expression of his soul and nature. That's an important point to make, and it's a point we stress. At the same time, he wasn't a Philistine when it came to the arts. He had a specific way of looking at arts, but he was very much engaged with the Zurich art scene in the early 20th century. The discussion of the meaning of art was very much a topic in his psychology club, and he himself built, as we now know and are able also to present through these publications nowadays, he built up a whole imagery corpus of his own, which can only be described as deeply fascinating again.
Yes, and you have 2 chapters in the book, along with Bettina Kaufmann. You wrote a chapter on Jung and modern art, but then you also wrote the chapter C.G. Jung, the Collector, which goes over all the, I kind of want to say, eclectic collection, mostly from his travels to Africa and to India. And there are beautiful photos in this book. I love this book. I highly encourage the listeners to take a look at it, purchase a copy, because it is something that is so rich. It also includes the paintings that he did early on, back in when he was in his 20s, right? But he started carving. I recall, actually, it's in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, the little 2-inch mannequin that he carved at the end of his ruler, and he put it in a pencil box, and he made a little bed for it. And I mean, just so creative, and he was so influenced also by other art, and his home is filled with beautiful art.
That's correct, and I mean, what I presented in that chapter on Jung as a collector is only the beginning of that research.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's much more to be done, and with the family archive and the museum now in place, I'm sure there will be a deeper investigation into his collection. It was mostly the aim of that book chapter to illustrate the wide range, but also to find the thread that goes through his collection. You call it an eclectic collection, and that is right. Then, when you first look at what was in the house at the time of his death, then he's not like a specialist on a certain art period or a certain culture that he would roam about. But what I stated in the article, and what is my conviction, is he was a collector of knowledge, and again, that knowledge that was contained mostly in symbolic representations, mm-hmm. and that is why and his sense was always attuned to such images. So whenever he was traveling the world, he would not only take in personalities or nature, but he would always connect the development of his psychological work with what he saw, and obviously as some of his fundamental ideas, such as collective unconscious and the archetypes, he was looking for traces that would prove his ideas. Yes. Right. So whenever he had another example of, he would collect be it just a postcard with a picture of that, or he would draw a little sketch in one of his journals or his agendas, or even in some of his letters, he would include a little photo or a sketch of an image or of a cultural imagery representation he thought remarkable and that he could connect to his other readings and visual repository, so to speak. So that is how I look at his collection, and in that sense, also the library is part of that collection. Mm-hmm. It really is a reflection of his interests and his work, and that makes the collection fascinating. Apart from the fact that some of these objects obviously carry anecdotal worth. Of course, where somewhere in the family there's still an old stone axe he exchanged for his modern day axe when he was on his expedition to East Africa. So having, I find that fascinating when you have the story to where he got in possession of a certain object, the context, which may tell you something how this object came into his collection, or even why, or what. With some objects, obviously, they were gifts. People knew of his interests. But others, he actively was purchasing, or even, as I explained, he was able to exchange some of his own goods to get in possession of something like the old stone axe I mentioned. So I find this beautiful. It tells us something where he was intrigued by an object, and so that there's hardly anything, in my view, in his life and his connection that is just there by coincidence. He was someone who put, I think, the things that surrounded him, objects, books, they all. You can be assured of most that they carried a special significance and meaning to him. And that is why these are so important also when studying Jung and studying his work.
That they are symbolic representations. And I did pull this out of the chapter. I have it in bold and underlined. You said, viewing the collection in the larger context of his research interests makes clear that Jung collected primarily knowledge, especially apparently lost, discarded, or hitherto inaccessible knowledge about the human psyche and its collective roots, assembled with a systematic desire, indeed a passion. Dr. Fischer, thank you so much for your time today, for going over all of this information with us. And I would like to thank your family for making all of this available to us. It means so much. Thank you.
Thank you very much again for having me, and thank you for the audience who is listening to your podcast. Thank you.
Please visit our website, Speaking of Jung, that's JUNG.com, for more information on everything that was discussed in this episode. There you will also find all of the previous episodes of this podcast, which are available to stream or to download for free. Speaking of Jung is also available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Amazon Music, and it will be available later in the week on our YouTube channel, Jungian Laura. So with special thanks to Dr. Carl C. Jung at the Foundation of the Works of C.G. Jung, Dr. Murray Stein, and Dr. Nancy Swift-Forlati, this is Laura London, and you've been listening to Speaking of Jung.